You know how to book flights and hotels. All you're missing is a tool to plan the travel experiences you'll have once you arrive. That's why you need Viator. Book guided tours, excursions, and more in one place. There are over 300,000 travel experiences to choose from, so you can find something for everyone. And Viator offers free cancellation and 24/7 customer support for worry-free travel. Download the Viator app now and use code Viator10 for 10% off your first booking in the app. Find travel experiences for you. Do more with Viator. What's the easiest choice you can make? Window instead of middle seat? Picking a vendor who sends a great gift basket? Outsourcing business tasks you hate? What about selling with Shopify? Whether you're selling a little or a lot, Shopify helps you do your thing, however you cha-ching. Shopify is the global commerce platform that helps you sell at every stage of your business. From the launch your online shop stage to the first real-life store stage, all the way to the did we just hit a million orders stage? Shopify's there to help you grow. Whether you're selling scented soap or offering outdoor outfits, Shopify helps you sell. Wherever and whatever you're selling, Shopify's got you covered. Sign up for a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/try. Go to shopify.com/try now to grow your business, no matter what stage you're in. Shopify.com/try.
Hi there, and welcome to Comedy Album Book Club, the podcast in which we listen to an influential, loved, hated, or rarely heard comedy album, and then talk about it with comedians and comedy nerds. I'm your host, Jason DeLine, an actor and comedy enthusiast. In this episode, we discuss Lenny Bruce's album Live at Carnegie Hall. Recorded on February 3rd, 1961, it was released as an album of about a half hour, and in 1972, an unabridged version was released, which was about 2 hours. We recommend listening to whichever version you have the time for before listening to the rest of this episode. Leonard Alfred Schneider was born October 13th, 1925 in Mineola, a village on Long Island in New York. He served in the U.S. Navy during World War II, once getting reprimanded for doing a comedy show for his fellow shipmates while dressed in drag. The incident resulted in him being discharged as the ship's medical officer was convinced he was having homosexual tendencies. Back in New York, Bruce started his comedy career unsure of how to stand out among the other comedians in the city. One of these comics, Joe Ansis, took Lenny under his wing and helped him find his voice. In 1947, after changing his name to Lenny Bruce, his first stand-up performance in Brooklyn earned him $12 and a spaghetti dinner. He developed a free-form style that was known for satire, political commentary, sex, religion, and vulgarity. He released 4 albums and touched on topics that other comics wouldn't speak about for decades, such as abortion, drugs, and racism. In 1964, he was convicted in an obscenity trial, which he was later pardoned for by Governor Pataki in 2003, 37 years after his death in 1966. A hero to many comedians, Bruce broke down many barriers and was a champion of free speech. His influence is widely felt. He was immortalized in the 1974 Bob Fosse film Lenny, starring Dustin Hoffman. Today, I'm joined by my producer and fellow comedy nerd, Matthew Ardill, and comedian Andrew Lizotte. How are you, fellas?
Great.
Good. Great. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here. I'm always had here. Thanks for letting me be had as well. So I'll ask you first, Andrew. So you're a big fan of Lenny, right?
Oh, totally. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you remember your first time hearing him or this album?
I think I was probably about 19. Someone got me a bootleg box set of something called Lenny Bruce Buyer Beware as a birthday present, for just being like, oh, you would really love this person. And I had never actually heard a Lenny Bruce bit before.
Right. Did you know who he was? Or
I knew that he cursed and got in trouble for it. And I
did
was
that
just
appeal
like,
to you?
At 19, I'm like, yeah, cursing is
Fight the power.
Shit. Is anyone's mom home? I'm going to say shit. Yeah.
And when you heard it, were you a fan right away?
I was, just because there was ideas expressed that I'd never thought of before. And he did it in such a way that was still like palatable and interesting. And I also just liked it's sort of a backwards way to learn about like the 50s and 60s.
Right.
Yeah. And it's funny because like listening to him talk about stuff, it got me into jazz. And then I found all my grandmother's old jazz albums. So it was, yeah.
And did you enjoy that? Did you get into jazz because of Lenny and Bruce?
I actually did. I am one of those pretentious people that actually like jazz. Not all jazz. Like I'll pick an era or some stuff's too weird, but I think that's like any musical genre. Like there's something good in every genre and there's bad things in every genre.
Sure.
Yeah.
So we skipped over your intro a little bit. You are a comedian here in Toronto.
Oh, yes.
And you host a monthly show at Comedy Bar called
Stupid Fancy.
So can you tell us what that is?
So basically, I get a different local artist every month to do an exhibition of their work, about like 10 to 14 pieces. And then comedians...
This is, what do you mean? Oh, like visual art, like paintings or...
You know what? Honestly, visual art, paintings.
Right.
I had a tattoo artist up last month. I'm having someone read tarot cards.
Okay.
For the comedians next month. I've had clay and like actual sculpture art. It really depends on the month. It's whatever you want to make it.
And then the comedians do what with that?
They base their set on the art that
Completely
they've never seen
improvised
before.
Set.
Yeah, it's sort of like a Rorschach test for comedians.
Wow, it sounds terrifying.
It is.
It's well attended and it's fun, I imagine.
Yeah, surprisingly,
it's probably a lot different than the
No,
average.
I get up there and I see the audience. I'm like, wow, I thought I really alienated everybody, but clearly. And then I just doubled down on it. I bought several silk smoking jackets to wear during the show.
Nice.
I also have a giant bucket of fortune cookies if they get stuck. So I'm just like, well, here's another idea, but it's not too simple.
So you've written the fortune cookie?
No,
things?
I go to Asian markets and I just buy them in bulk.
So they're real fortunes.
They're real fortunes.
I love it. Do you play jazz throughout the evening as well?
I don't.
I think that'd be like the perfect icing on the cake.
I think so.
Yeah.
That sounds like the perfect.
I think my producer was just like, no, let's get some people comfortable and interested. So
Right.
like,
Yeah, that might alienate the last few who come.
he plays classical music and we're like it's kind of fitting with the gimmick.
Right.
My roommate for Christmas actually got me a monocle, which I use in the show to read the fortunes because it's dark. And so it's like, it's a really shticky bit that actually helps.
So the idea is sort of it's this faux elevated, sophisticated evening
like
kind of
a
thing.
French salon.
Okay.
Where artists meet to discuss ideas. Because I never like people who are just one thing. I like everybody talking to make a new thing. And to be honest, before I started doing stand-up, I wanted to be an animator. And then enough people told me, like, you're not good at this. Like, everyone around me could draw better faster than me. But then they're like, but you write the word bubble. So I'm like, okay, so maybe there's something here.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Cool. Matt, how about you? Do you remember your first?
Dr. Demento show back in the 80s. So I was probably around 11, 12 when I first heard it. And it is completely age inappropriate. Now, it wasn't the entire album. It was the Jesus and Moses bit on the Dr. Demento show.
Yeah.
He'd run that. And it stuck with me. And it was like, oh, wow, that's I didn't think about that. And it got me thinking about like, poverty and the greed of the church. And that's sort of like, it was like a gear shift for me as a kid.
Right.
Especially growing up, not a religious home, but like, there's a lot of faith in and around my life.
Right.
So it sort of got me thinking about things a bit differently.
So this would be mid 80s, I guess.
Yeah, probably 85.
85.
Yeah.
So we'd already had Carlin, Pryor, people like that. So did you come to Bruce before them or
simultaneous?
Simultaneous.
So it's like I was
Okay.
like dumped in the deep end of like subversive comic thought.
Right. Yeah.
Because like,
interesting.
Yeah, there's an hour of comedy on Chum in the like I think into the 90s. When radio was still a viable platform.
Right.
And they would just like every Sunday night. So from 10 to 11, I'd listen to like that. And then from 11 to 12, it was like The Shadow and like radio
Very
play
cool.
kind of stuff. And so I was like, I was listening to all of these comics and like it was like prior, Lenny Bruce, Carlin, all of that stuff. And it's funny because like the stuff that it wasn't the more subversive stuff for Carlin, like Wino Radio and bits like that.
Right.
Which are sort of like not his like he has some really lame stuff early on.
Like they probably played the Hippy Dippy Weatherman.
Hippy Dippy
like
Weatherman,
that.
yeah. So it's like his earlier material, but which would actually be closer to being concordant with this Bruce stuff they were playing, kind of stuff, because that would come in the late 60s, early 70s, and this would have been like early to mid 60s was his stuff.
Okay. And so it opened your mind to some stuff, but are you still a fan? Do you
Yeah, I mean, if you go back, I became critical and jaded towards this material after a while, but that was because I hadn't been listening to it.
Okay.
And I sort of like had it through that filter of time.
Right.
But going back and listening to it again, I'm like, oh no, I get it now. And so like, if you listen to old podcasts, I've been unkind to Mr. Bruce. But like returning to it and actually listening to it in seriousness, I'm like, oh, I understood where he was aiming with those jokes. So like refreshing the mind and not like the context of I'm a 12, 13-year-old listening to it.
Right.
And that memory of the joke, but like, a 40-something person who knows how comedy works and knows how joke structure works. And it's like, oh no, he was not being a dick about this. His intent is the opposite of how I interpret it as the time.
Yeah, he seems much more progressive than a lot of people at the time. I mean, decades ahead of his time for what comedians are willing to talk about.
For sure.
I came about finding out who he was sort of in a strange way. I was a teenager and just really into movies. I was a huge movie buff, and I was a comedy buff too, but I think a little after his era. I was big into people in the 70s. I loved Steve Martin and some 60s stuff, Smothers Brothers and stuff like that, and Carlin, obviously. But when I first sort of knew who he was, it was through the movie Lenny. And I had sort of heard the name Lenny Bruce, but this is in the 90s, and it wasn't always that easy to just get an album that people had been talking about like it is now. You can find anything online. So I had never really heard him or seen a special of him or anything, but I knew he was in this movie. So I rented this movie, Lenny, with Dustin Hoffman, and I didn't like it. I might have been too young to sort of appreciate it. I found it very dry.
There was a lot of nudity. Did that rope you back?
I don't even remember that. It was a while ago, but I remember not liking Dustin Hoffman as Lenny Bruce. I thought he didn't seem like a very funny comedian to me. I mean, Dustin Hoffman isn't the first person you think of when you think of, the funniest actors out there. I mean, he's done some stuff later. I Heart Huckabees. He did some funny stuff in that. And he has a funny way, but I don't think it was the right casting.
Yeah.
So for a long time, I pictured Lenny Bruce as Dustin Hoffman, which isn't fair. And then
shame on you.
It was only the last couple years that I revisited him again. And I think sort of like you, I appreciate what he's doing. Well, maybe you didn't say this, but I appreciate what he's doing more than I enjoy it. I don't find him particularly funny, which might be a controversial thing to say, but I find him clever.
Yeah.
And I admire his energy, much of it drug fueled, of course, but I admire the confidence he has to just string things together. Like I'd be interested to see his process, because it seems like he's out there with no plan, and that he has ideas he's mulled around, but I don't know if he has written bits, he doesn't seem like that kind of.
He burns material pretty fast from like in the longer when he talks about that. And he kind of, and he talks about Bob Newhart in the longer episode, in the longer album, kind of touches on that too. Whereas like when he gets bored with it, when he doesn't cook with it, as he says, he just abandons it.
Yeah. And that's cool. But it's really interesting. I feel like changed what comedy was into something else.
Oh, for sure.
without quite doing what it ended up being because of his influence, if you know what
Yeah.
I mean. We wouldn't have. I mean, I think you mentioned before we were recording that he basically invented the form. And
and then kind of like Carlin and Pryor were just like, okay, let's nail some stuff down.
Yeah.
So we're not like, let's put in a net.
And those are the perfect two people to mention right away. I think they were the closest at the time who were watching what he was doing and emulating it. But I, in my opinion, perfected it. And I mean, that kind of is nice when somebody invents something and then you can shape it. Of course, you're going to be able to improve it and do better. But I think Carlin is the master of that form.
Yeah, and I mean, he was very supportive of younger talent as well.
Right. Well, I mean, he had someone take him under his wing too. I mean,
I think Joan Rivers talks about how like when it's her and Cosby and Woody Allen doing the folk bar circuit in New York, he'd come out and watch them to gigs. I mean, that entire shtick in Mrs. Maisel about him kind of mentoring her in a way is not based on nothing.
Yeah,
there is that relationship that he had with younger talent, and I think in a way, I mean, I'm projecting here, but based on the way he speaks of it in his material, I think he'd be happy that he helped transform the medium, not necessarily himself, but through subsequent generations of comics.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it seemed to me too, like in sort of later recordings, it seemed like he was going on a bit of an ego trip. Like, I think he seemed like he was a pretty big fan of himself, I would say. Would you guys say he comes across that way as, I mean, he definitely has confidence.
He had righteous anger,
right?
I think, because like every bit that he writes is about like, this is what we say we're doing, and this is what's actually happening. So as soon as like he could actually prove there was a government conspiracy out to get him, how would you not go a little bit crazy from that?
Right. Well, and plus his addiction to drugs was getting worse as well, which is going to affect.
So it's like a catch-22. He's addicted to drugs, and the government are persecuting him, so he takes drugs because he thinks the government are persecuting him, and then they persecute him for taking. It's like he's caught in this vicious cycle of self-fulfilling prophecy in a way.
Yeah. Well, it ended up killing him. Yeah. But I don't know if it's ego so much as I think I agree with Andrew, and it's that it's like it's not about him; it's about a broken system.
Yeah.
In an entire broken society where, they like the entire thread of this album, like I've written it down over and over and over again, hypocrisy.
Yeah.
Like the hypocrisy of society on so many levels, like the Vegas bit in the album where it's all about, because back then the mob hadn't given up on pretending not to run Vegas because there's like a new enterprise for them. So it's like, we have to have this air of proper stuff. So here's some art and here's some classical music. And it's like, it's just tits and ass. That's what people are going to Vegas for.
100%. And even just the side bit where he's just like, we all know gay people exist, right? But it was the 50s. So we were doing that, like, Leave It to Beaver. Like, everything's fine. Communism isn't real.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. It's funny too. Like I talked to my grandmother who, passed away a couple of years ago. And, we talked about how there was a gay man across the street from her growing up, and her it was the exact same thing as in that bit. It's like the mom is like, I can't believe he's not married. He's such a nice boy. It's like, this is Winnipeg in 1952. It's not gonna happen.
You made it sound like Rear Window, where she's just up with binoculars like, there's a gay man across the street. I swear to you, it's not in my head.
Call the authorities.
Yeah.
It blew my mind to hear him talk about that kind of stuff in such a frank, open way. Not really beating around the bush, not using innuendo, like just coming out and saying, this is happening, this is the deal, and people seemed receptive to it too.
And I mean, interestingly, that's I think what got him arrested more than curse words. It's like he's broaching these subjects that like the society is like, that is obscene.
Well, he wasn't charged with profanity. It was vulgarity and an obscenity.
Right. And it didn't start happening until after a judge tried to get him to give him a bribe, and he went to the news with it. And then all of a sudden, everyone took a real interest in him.
Is that right? Oh,
Yeah.
wow. I hadn't heard that story.
There's a bunch of, it's a super weird mythology because there's stuff that, like, if you watch Lenny, it was written from the perspective or the retelling of his mom and his wife. And then if you read How to Talk Dirty and Influence People, it's from his perspective of what happened.
But that
and then
was-
there's an in-between.
But that wasn't even written by him, right? Like that was written by
He wrote
by
it,
Krasner, wasn't
and
it?
then Paul Krasner he had to edit it
Right.
while Lenny was in prison and kind of pieced it together to make a cohesive narrative. Because
Right.
like I could only imagine how long the book would be when you have nothing but time.
Well, I mean, he did a 2-hour comedy album.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah. His book would be 6 volumes, I
Yeah.
would think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now Krasner was a protege of Bruce, right?
I believe so. I know he was a social satirist.
Yeah, and they hung out, and Krasner interviewed Bruce for Playboy at one point.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't really know that much more about him.
Right. Everybody, it always bugged me when Hugh Hefner died that it's just like Hugh Hefner was actually a really big proponent for free speech. And
Yeah.
like he published interviews with black people. I'm like, that's the bare minimum of being a good person. Like he's also on record as like calling Quaaludes like thigh openers and stuff like that. I'm like, no, he was not.
Yeah,
Yeah.
not the best of us.
Yeah.
No.
Although from someone else who also has many silk smoking jackets like that, that was tight. Game recognizes
Well,
game.
yeah, it can excuse a lot of bad behavior if you wear a good silk
Yeah.
smoking
Smoking
jacket.
jacket,
People
yeah.
will think you're a man of the world.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's I don't know. I've found that like there's so many stories
About him?
about
Yeah.
Lenny Bruce,
Yeah.
just about and it's like hard to draw the line, like you're saying. And the movie is based on two other people's recounting. The book is his own recounting.
Recounting.
And then you've got like these other vectors coming in of people
Right.
like this is actually what happened here. This is what's happening. Like I was reading up on Don Friedman, who did the introduction
Oh,
to
yeah.
that, who's a jazz pianist. And it's like, what a weird choice to have introduce and
Yeah.
offer this commentary at the top
Oh,
of
it's
your
so
album
weird.
about
Yeah.
the dirty comic or the sick comic, which
Also,
is,
what a terrible intro for comedy.
yeah, it's like this guy's going to offend you.
Yeah.
But he's really, it's like,
We're
This
saying
is
important
high
things.
art. You should all
Yeah.
be thankful
Yeah.
of like,
Ugh.
you know what's conducive to comedy? Lecturing.
yeah. And the funny part is like Friedman met him when going to a strip joint back in the 50s.
Yeah.
And Lenny was still emceeing the burlesque club. So it's
Right.
like going to a burlesque show. The burlesque act bailed. So Lenny goes backstage and then comes out naked. So that's how they met.
Yeah.
And then years later, he has him introducing this like really heavy thing. And the irony being that introduction is as relevant to comedy now as it was in 1961.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like there's that concept of context is king, which is another theme that runs all through the album, like context.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, he has a bit of moral relativism, which is I'm not is a little bit tricky.
Right.
Whereas I understand what he's trying to say, but in practice,
What specifically?
Oh, well, I mean, he talks about how, you know, what's right for you is what's right for me may not be right for you, but what's right for me, I'm trying to, what bit is that?
Yeah. It's a very 60s.
Yeah,
moment.
It's very, yeah. I'm okay. You're okay.
Yeah, like the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan bit that
Mm-hmm.
he did, and point of view. You know, he's like, you know, what cooks for you? It cooks for you, man.
right.
And so it's all about, you know, American exceptionalism, hypocrisy. Like those are the core themes. But ultimately, so like there is a line, and that's kind of, it's interesting because he's sort of playing I think he was struggling with that line too, because of that very intro. He's trying to explain, context is important. And what I'm saying is these things are wrong.
Quality is subjective.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So it's an interesting thing, like viewing his work through that lens.
Well, it's also an interesting thing to like, this also exists as a time capsule, which is very interesting to see how people were talking about things, what they weren't talking about, what the issues were. And I still find that fascinating because a lot of people who will not even put on the album are like, he makes a lot of references I don't get. And I don't understand that personally because the complete like human consciousness exists in a little brick in your pocket. Like if you don't know something, look it up.
To be fair, like he does have a bit about that, like literally, so people didn't get him back then either.
Yeah.
And because like, as he said, his language is larded with the hipster idiom, the Jewish idiom, the high intellect idiom. I'm like, okay, the fact you're using idiom in a bit is like, that's already a stretch. You're already flexing there.
Yeah.
You're like really doubling down on the fact like, I'm the smartest man in the room. Which he is a very smart man. And it's like, but the complaint about like, I don't get it. I'm like, use the internet, look it up. But like Spritzo, I had to piece that one together on my own because that's not. I'm like, maybe
that's a fun one. I like that one.
But a lot of the bits are explained thoroughly but succinctly enough that even if you don't get every reference in them, you understand what he's talking about. He explains it to you. Yeah. And he doesn't really waste a lot of words. I mean, right off the top, this album starts a little shaky. It's him doing some.
Well, he has to get out of the hole of the preachy intro.
Yeah, right. He
like
really
this
has
is
to
a
get them
good
on
album
side.
for like, how's he gonna get out of this?
Right.
And then all the technical failures where he just sort of leans into it and just makes a sandwich out of them because it's like
Carnegie Hall's wired for instrument sound, not for talk. It's a completely different mic. It's a whole. Yeah. This is a whole separate podcast that no one wants to hear, so I'll drop it. But just like find a red ring mic. Thank you. Or no, blue. Oh my God.
There you go. You almost misled people.
This is 50-50 chance.
Yeah.
Good luck, Carnegie Hall, if you're listening.
Get it together, Carnegie Hall.
But yeah, I like that he does make something out of those bits, but he doesn't ever attack the venue. He doesn't like make fun of the text and stuff.
He's playful with them. Like, you're not going to eat tonight.
He acknowledges human error and is playful about it.
Well, even that, like, it's not really a heckler, but it's like a dicky fan who's shouting out at one point, and then he starts a conversation about like how much he paid for those seats and the balcony, and then he's like, wait a second, you can hear me, we're having a conversation. You just want to be on the album.
Which is also the point of the plane bit, because he's just like, here's an example of me being a dick and not acknowledging in the moment. Like, I have to make it here even if I'm probably gonna die in a plane. Which, like, what year did Buddy Holly die in the plane? Like, that might be
59, I think.
Yeah, 59. So fairly like 3 years before that.
He should know. Like, that should be a fear in the back of his head.
But and that's kind of the point, though, because he's like, in what a flamboyant time we're in, where I can just be such a prick about this. Like, I can be so cavalier with not just my life, but the life of this pilot who's going to be flying me there because I'm like, I have to be there for this gig. I would lose $2,000 kind of thing. So it's like,
right.
Yeah, it's interesting.
It's really interesting because the fact that this exists is an important time capsule of like delving into the issues is such an opposite idea of how a lot of people are making comedy albums now about like, I want to make something that doesn't have those references so it can stand the test of time.
But then it's toothless ultimately and watered down sometimes. We're not talking about the things of our time, which I think is important.
Well, you'd never say that about like hip hop in the 80s. Like, one of the reasons like NWA and like Wu-Tang Clan and Tribe Called Quest is like, it was all talking about politics and what was relevant then.
Some themes just never go to style, for lack of a better term.
And I mean,
exactly.
In a way, sadly, this is still probably one of the more relevant albums that we've listened to on the show because so many of these themes continue to resonate now.
Yeah.
And I mean, in a way, like, it's kind of saddened that contemporary comics aren't addressing the issues as well as a guy in 1961 did.
Right.
Well, I mean, but that
Like not all, but some contemporary comics.
But not every comic is a political warrior either, and doesn't have to be.
But look at Dave Chappelle in his last three specials.
Here's a conversation. All right.
So all three of them have not dissimilar language to what is in this album. But
I'm drinking water now to get ready for a spit take.
But
I'm going to do visual humor over the radio.
There's a skewed point of view, I would say.
Yeah, but it punches in the exact wrong direction. Whereas Bruce aims up.
Yes,
like
he punches up.
He punches up.
He's anti-authoritarian.
Anti-authority. He's in the language he uses. At the time, the key difference is society didn't like glom on or grok, to use like 60s vernacular, that saying the F word was hurtful. You know, using these words in the way that he uses them is hurtful, because he was also friends and a clear ally of people of color, of gay people, of all these people that he seems to make fun of in there. But when you listen to the context, it's like, no. It's like an Archie Bunker situation. He's making fun of the people who think that way.
Yes. Yes, exactly.
Yeah. And Chappelle is like, I'm all about free speech. I'm all about truth to power. And then like
it's not punching up.
He's not punching up. No. He's
Lenny's
self-agreeing.
using the wrong word.
He's using the wrong word,
people.
but the right intent. Whereas he's
and
using,
at the time it was accepted.
Yeah,
right.
There were the language was less defined at that time, and whereas Chappelle's just lifting himself up, and in often cases lying as part of the bit, like the entire in Equanimity, the second of the three specials where he first doubles down.
Right.
He talks about this letter where he's deliberately vague about the origin of the letter.
Right.
And it turns out he's implying it was from a white trans woman.
Right.
The truth is it was from an Asian cisgendered male who was an ally of the trans community and he just reframes it all
as a better narrative
for self-aggrandizement. Whereas I don't think Bruce would do that. I don't think he would lie. Like I think it
would probably be less interesting to him.
Yeah, I mean, the truth is more interesting than the lie, and the truth is like, and I think that's the difference. Like, these are the big, truth tellers in the comedy world amongst mainstream comedy.
I think that's so funny because there's certain like comedy clubs you can go to where it'll be like a mural of like Lenny, Carlin, Bill Hicks, Kinnison as like these people like told the truth. I'm like, Lenny Bruce does a lot of like silly make him up bits. Like he's almost a sketch comedian by himself. Like it's all about love and relating. And Carlin also wanted to be a poet. Like he's up there with Lawrence Ferlinghetti. He cared about the rhythm and stuff more. And of this like
you hear all of that.
Yeah, and I feel like now it's just using an excuse for shock's sake.
Yeah, like for all of them. I mean, Kinnison I was less of a fan of, but and Bill Hicks he's a hard listen. Like he's a difficult listen at times.
Yeah.
You know what was funny for me is I grew up in a very religious household. And so like when Lenny Bruce did all these bits about anti-religion, I was like, oh my, oh, what's this? I better keep this a secret. But my dad, I learned very quickly if it was funny, you could get away with it. My dad liked Bill Hicks a lot more than Lenny Bruce. And just like, he's way harder on religion.
But all of them are very much about like the truth and the feeling, like they don't embellish because they don't need to. Like the spirit of the material is carried forward.
Oh, and they know their audience too.
Yeah.
Like I picture audiences for both of these guys, Hicks and Bruce, just nodding constantly, like you're speaking my language type of thing. And
I mean, the Bruce did the underground circuit before when it was literally all clubs that were underground.
Yeah.
Kind of
it was like cafes. It was the Hungry Eye and the Blue Angel, and they're like, and now that exists a little bit more stuff like Comedy Bar, where it's like it's a club-ish thing. It's redefined itself.
Yeah. I mean, and that's one of the reasons why I love that venue so much is it's much more in the spirit. Like, I mean, I can go to, Yuck Yucks. To name a
it
chain.
doesn't have that hole in the wall feel.
Yeah. I mean, like, and nothing against people who work at It's a paycheck.
Sure.
I can understand that. But if you want to go somewhere where you see something that's experimental, and a lot of the people who work at Yuck Yucks go to places like the Comedy Bar, and they cook. To use the,
well, it's where comics go, right?
Yeah.
Like if other comedians want to see comedians, they go to Comedy Bar or just hang out. Like if you go there on almost any night, have a couple of beers, you're going to see some of the best people in the city just hanging out, and you always have a great conversation, and it's very collaborative and dark, and I love it there.
It's that formula of low ceiling, dark walls.
Comedy can only happen in a basement.
Yes.
But even beyond that, like
you can get cell phone reception. It's not
right. It's not a good comedy venue.
But also with Yucks and Absolute, they push the goofiness in their presentation. Like I hate going to a show and it starts off, ladies and gentlemen, get ready to laugh. By the way, everyone's cars were towed. Ho, here we go. Like, it's just that real chuckle hut. Like, they've got some kid who's allowed to intro the show, and he thinks that's what comedy is. And, like, it just kills the cool factor.
But, like, Absolute threw me off the first couple times I did it because it looks like a normal club.
Yes.
But most of their poll is with college kids.
Yes.
So it was the first time... like I'm 32 and the audience is like 19 to 21. They're like, I don't relate to you, old man. I'm like, what happened?
And looping back to Lenny Bruce, that's a hilarious thing that in 1961, he was having that same conversation with his audience where it's like, okay, I'm not letting any of the olds in. Anybody who's older than 40, you're not allowed in. Oh, we're going to drink Coke and bringing fake ID. I'm like, no, get out of here. And it's like everybody's like, oh, so much has changed. I'm like, yeah, but so much is absolutely 100% the same at the same time. And that's what this album is really amazing for illustrating. It's like so much has come so far, and yet so much has stayed exactly where it was.
100%. As far as you were saying about like no one's really doing the time capsule bit, I find that Lewis Black is still good at that, and Greg Proops, because like Lewis Black has an album, the Performing Arts Center Blues. I forget what but it's like right after 9/11 happened, going into the Iraq War, and it's all political, and it's just like, if I had to listen to one to really get what was going on at the time, it would be that one. Greg Proops' last one was just all about Trump era and like insane billionaires controlling everything, and I'm like, I still find the timestamp really valuable because I'll make something else a couple of years from now.
Yeah. Well, and it's a neat, like you said before, it's a cool way to hear about history where you're being entertained. You know, if you're into comedy, it's a great way to see that moment in time or hear that moment in time. I'm curious to know how many Trump era albums will be popular in 10 years, because these days it seems like a very sort of cathartic thing to laugh through it. But do we want to relive it again in 10 years? Will we enjoy it or just be shaking our heads the whole time?
I went to Casa Loma last week. I'm completely spacing on the name of the comedian I saw. I'll put it in the notes when later on. But
I'm going to make a guess. Alonzo Bowden?
Yes. Thank you.
Hey, great.
Thank you. Yeah. And
thank you.
I had seen him just in bits before, so I hadn't really know his full, but like he talks about just being exhausted by he's like, people are like, oh, it's going to be a gold mine for comedy. And it's like, no, it's like when this asshat's out there doing stuff that's so ridiculous, you can't make fun of it because it's already its own joke.
Well, and it's pretty low hanging fruit. A lot of this stuff is so simple, and
nuke hurricanes. That's a real headline that happened. Well, and like the Onion must just be like drinking every day.
Well, every late night talk show host made a joke about it. I mean, it's hard to be fresh about what he's doing because all the things he does are in tweets. And
so they're the perfect amount of material.
They
are,
but it's hard to exploit and make fresh and new.
Well, when there's like a tweet storm every day.
How do you joke on top of a joke? Like you
it's
can't
borderline
satirize.
Yeah.
Like when you're making jokes about the Obama era, that's actually a nice challenge because
Yeah.
there was a lot to make jokes about. There's a lot
Sure.
of things that, like, as great as he
Clinton, too.
was, Clinton,
And then everyone before that.
like, there's lots of, like, but Obama, perfect example. Good president in a lot of ways, bad president in a lot of ways, and there's stuff to make jokes about, but you have to work for those jokes. And I think most comedians would rather work for their meal than just have it.
Yeah.
But
You know?
Trump just feels like, kicking a kid that fell down in a way.
Yeah.
But he's in the highest position of power imaginable. It's a weird conundrum.
I'm very curious how Lenny Bruce would handle Trump's America. It's
Well, I mean, Mort Saul is still doing a weekly show that you can live stream, and like they're contemporaries. He's still around.
That's true.
So, like,
And that was an interesting bit that he did too, talking about it's cut from the 30-minute album, but where he's talking about his contemporaries, and he's like talking about the comedy around him.
there's a good interview. They let him host a radio hour and just talk about comedy, and he's just like, here's some good joke writers that I don't like as people. And what's his old black and white film star, W.C. Fields.
Oh, yes.
yeah.
Famous anti-Semite. He's just like, oh, he's a terrible person. Good
Right.
jokes. Good jokes.
Yeah, like, you can hate the guy, but enjoy the work. But
Yeah.
like he talks about Mort Saul, Bob Newhart, Shelley Berman, and he has this great story about Shelley not realizing there's a bunch of mobsters right in front of him.
Yeah.
And it's like, yeah, this is a time when you were doing comedy. It wasn't, it was literally not a safe space. It was like,
even Pryor has that bit about the mob boss that wasn't going to pay him, and he didn't know they were part of the mafia.
and they're just like laughing at him, like, look at this kid, like get him some Stromboli.
I love that bit so much.
Yeah.
I love his voice.
And he's talking about, like, he was like there's a musician that he was working with at the club at the time, and he's like an older jazz singer, and that's an awesome bit.
Yeah.
That he does.
Yeah.
But like,
As much
And
as
a great
things
moment
change.
in time. Yeah.
yeah.
Well, speaking of that, do you think this album, what if this album came out today? You think most people would get it? You think most people would appreciate it? Or do you think you have to be a history nerd, a comedy nerd to like it?
Well, guess first.
I think we're just catching up to where it is now. Like the bit about how, like, it's weird how people refuse to acknowledge gay people, like that wouldn't hold up.
Right.
What I find interesting is the bit where he's talking about how great capitalism is. He hasn't hit trickle down economics in the 80s.
Right.
Yeah.
Where, like, now cell phone companies have all made this like agreement to, like, if we all give bad service, where are they going to go?
Yeah.
Right? Like, it is the communist thing he was talking about. It's sort of like reverse relevant things he didn't know yet.
Right.
Yeah. I mean,
So people now wouldn't, it's not that they wouldn't understand the concepts, but they wouldn't be able to relate to it because it doesn't make sense to them because of how history's unfolded. since.
Yeah, it's just like, this would seem like 3 months too late, which is
Right.
also sad because it was made in the 60s. So what, it's been
Right.
like
Yeah.
40, 50 years?
Yeah, it's been relevant that long.
I remember listening to this when I was 19, and he does a bit about weed is going to be legal because all the biggest potheads he knows are lawyers. And I remember like early 2000s being like, yeah, any day now. That's going to...
Meanwhile, they've been waiting 40 years for that prophecy to come true.
And I still had to wait like 20.
I mean, personally, I think it's a 50-50 thing. The themes are still relevant. The core messages are still relevant in a lot of the pieces. I think the language is a barrier.
Dig.
Totally.
Dig.
I still enjoy Dig.
I sent an email this morning, and it was like about mentioning money, and I almost used bread. Because I've been listening to this album so much, and then I was like, "Oh, no, that doesn't make sense." And then I was like, "Scratch." I'm like, "What the hell?"
Now, when you said language, I assumed you mean what would be considered inflammatory now, like the slurs and whatnot.
Both.
But yeah, you think the beatnik speak is not
Did
accessible?
anyone notice where he says in the Christ and Moses bit, he says friggin'? And almost hesitantly, like he almost dropped the full F-bomb, but like even he
pulled
didn't
out
want to.
just in the last moment. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. Like, no, but yeah, I think both. That's that 50-50 thing. Like the certain language that he uses is unacceptable, and certain language that he uses is accessible.
I would say most of it is accessible though. I don't especially
You
in the
still get
context.
context
Yeah,
clues.
exactly.
Yeah, like as I said, like the core
Yeah.
themes are there, and
Yeah.
I mean it's listenable. Like if you're listening to this as a modern ear, I think you can understand it.
I think people
maybe-
that weren't going to listen to it weren't curious in the first place.
But
But I mean, I even modern comedians, there might be 2 or 3 phrases they say that I don't understand.
But putting it in the context of a modern audience, I think, and that's again, it comes back to that introduction where he needed that warning. Current comedy culture is kind of regressive in a way, and in the mainstream, where it's going back to that you are saying something that's challenging me,
Right.
You're wrong. And
we don't prepare people for that anymore in comedy. We want to be, or comedians seem to want to be as inflammatory as possible, or as provocative as possible.
Okay, we were talking about Archie Bunker
Yeah.
before this, and to make it more controversial, I'm going to say that the following is a quote from Bill Cosby. But back in the day, he had a big problem with All in the Family because he's just like, if you're a racist watching that show, Archie Bunker never learns anything. Like he doesn't grow as a person.
Yep.
So the person watching doesn't know that they have to change either because he didn't learn anything.
But interesting, the most powerful episodes of those shows, like there's this recurring arc. I'm forgetting the name of the character, but it's a trans woman who is on 3 episodes, and it starts like he saves her, and it's like the standard, like, oh, forgotten, like missed, I thought you were a woman, gave you mouth to mouth. Oh my goodness. And all of the hijink. But even by the end of that episode, there's growth because that character ends up pulling his ass out of the fire. The second one, it continues that growth arc where they become almost family-like. And then the third one is a tragic ending, but ends up totally robbing, and like the character dies in a horrible way, and they don't sugarcoat it. And Archie is shaken. Edith loses her faith in God by the end of the episode.
I remember this.
And it's like, so I mean, it's almost like a long game with that show where they're setting up like they're so I think Cosby's not wrong in that.
Oh, that's something you don't hear very often.
Yeah, that's the last time you'll hear me say that.
Mark the time on that recorder.
Yeah. In that context of like in a lot of episodes, it doesn't feel like Archie has personal growth,
Right.
but they play it out over like the long game of the series in a way, which is, I think, what we're missing. Like people are so impatient with their comedy now. They're like, if this isn't right out of the gate, or if this isn't saying what I want out of the gate, like, they're not good to me.
Well, I've got a couple thoughts on that too. Is that, well, to me, one, Archie Bunker was shown as a buffoon. He wasn't like a hero to the American people where he should be an example to everyone.
Yeah.
But B, TV shows are out there to make money. So if they can appeal to 2 different audiences, they're probably okay with that.
Yeah. I will say, okay, I got 2 things on this. One, I used to work as an artistic director for geriatric theatrical sketch comedy troupe at a retirement home. That's right. I am a Wes Anderson film.
Geriatric theatric.
Yeah. And
I can already imagine the soundtrack to that movie right now.
plus, it was called Lions Manor. And what happened was it was right next to the university, and their residents kept dying because they're old people. I'm sorry. But they needed student housing. So like the teenagers moved in with it. It was like Animal House in reverse. This is a whole separate podcast. But what I will say is being around that many old people, I did hear a lot of old people go like, I miss Archie Bunker. He said a lot of things that people were thinking, like, you didn't beat it out 100%.
Right.
And to move it forward, Anthony Jeselnik, a lot of people will say he's playing a character, and then you could argue, like, does everyone know that?
Yeah.
Because the last time Jeselnik was in town, I went, I watched, there's good jokes there, but I was in a crowd where I thought I was going to get the shit beat out of me
For
on
laughing?
the way home. No. Just because historically I look very Jewish and I'm not, but I have gotten a lot of anti-Semitism regardless. And there's,
And you think that they're fans of his because they buy into it as legitimate?
And like the interesting
wow,
part about
100%.
I don't think you can really know who he is and believe that.
I mean, like he's and the
about
thing. The
him.
thing about Jeselnik too is he's come out and literally said PC culture is the right way to be,
Yeah.
and that is important that we're politically and socially aware in our speech.
You can also hear it in his comedy.
Yeah, so
I mean,
it's one of those cases where the fan it's like my issue with White Zombie in the 90s.
Yeah.
I hate the fans, but I love the band.
well,
Right?
people
Rick and
people pick
Morty
and
is
choose
kinda
things.
like that.
Yeah. Rick and Morty is exactly like that.
Yeah.
And you can't blame the art because people pick out ugliness and champion it. That's not the fault of the artist. I don't think it's the responsibility of an artist to make sure there's nothing someone can take and exploit and turn evil.
But I mean, it's how they.
I don't know. How do you see
yeah.
Jeselnik? Do you think he needs to take a bit more responsibility about that?
I don't know, honestly.
Yeah.
I just, because people are going to go like, he says one thing, but he's really talking to me. And like,
Right.
how do we combat that?
And I mean, and like,
Right.
like he has actively come out
Well, that's it.
against those people misinterpreting his,
But that
his
doesn't
material.
stop
But that doesn't.
people
does
doing
that.
it.
It's like
eventually.
like where's the
sort
where?
of ways.
Yeah. That's it's an argument and discussion. I don't think we'd be able to resolve between
No,
the three. of us.
exactly. But it's
interesting.
Yeah.
It's interesting. Well, I'm sorry that's been your experience, and it's unfortunate. When I first saw Anthony Jeselnik, I saw him live at the Comedy Store in L.A., and I wasn't a fan. I thought this guy's just being a jerk for the sake of. But I watched his most recent Netflix special, and I thought it was brilliant. I really liked it. It was dark and definitely controversial, but you can just tell that he's trying to make people uncomfortable. And at that recording, everyone in the room is like, I think they get it.
Yeah.
Like there's a point where he talks about, tells this really long story about taking a friend to get an abortion. And just as he says that, he turns to the crowd and says, get on board right now if you're going to. Like, he just doesn't want to have the discussion about whether abortion's okay or not. I helped a friend do this. And like, I feel like there's a lot of that peppered in his stuff where he's like, this story is awful and makes me look like a jerk. But clearly the bigger picture is that this is not the way to be in life. Like, he makes a joke about something about how he has AIDS. I mean, he clearly doesn't. He makes himself sort of the butt of that. I'm afraid I'm starting to defend Anthony Jeselnik for.
But it's just like people take whatever they want from anything.
Well, and that's the problem, yeah. And whose responsibility is it?
Yeah, and I mean, you could easily listen to this album and come away with like, oh, he's like homophobic. Or,
right.
You know, like,
well, he's saying things we wouldn't allow him to say. Like, he would be strung up for saying.
And
something
I
like
seriously think, because of the context of how he was saying this language that was offensive at the time, I don't think he'd use those words today.
No, I agree.
I think he'd be using different language that was equally as inflammatory.
Yeah.
But in a different context, because I think he's like, because that is the one thing that is key to all
and
of
he
his
was
material.
obsessed with
Punching
being
up.
hip.
Yes.
Yeah, that's true. It's not cool to be a homophobe.
Yeah.
Well, we've sort of talked about his influence. I mean, it's pretty far reaching. I don't even know how we would nail down someone who is now directly influenced, because he was sort of in a class by himself at the time. Not a lot of peers who were doing the things he was, but then everyone after seems to have borrowed something from him. So who would you say is a direct descendant? Can we even figure that out?
I think, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but in a way, I kind of think pretty much everybody in working in the
that's what I'm saying.
field is a descendant.
Unless they've gone in a completely
Like,
different
you
direction,
have-
like Emo Phillips or something like that.
Yeah,
is
well,
probably
Emo
not-
Phillips would interestingly be more of a Bob Newhart descendant in a
Oh,
way,
that's
working
an
with
interesting
because
conversation, yeah.
Bob
That would
Newhart
be-
is a peer and worked in a very different mode.
Yes.
And he's sort of more absurdist and silly.
Yep.
And that's the vein that emo works in.
I suppose.
And so I think,
much bigger and
much, but it's still
ridiculous,
blown out. It's dialed up.
That's interesting.
I would put James Adomian in with Jonathan Winters,
Yeah.
for example, because he'll still do some stand up, but he'll do it through character.
Yeah.
To also get away with stuff. And Jonathan Winters was like the covert spy of being subversive, like with the grandma that was really into sex, or the cop that was like, I'll be back to shoot you later. And like,
we got to do a Jonathan Winters episode.
Yeah, we do.
His talent is so far reaching too, and has different modes. And,
Yeah.
But that's a while back too.
Yeah.
and a contemporary of.
And I
that's-
think Marin has a lot. I mean, I don't think he's as clear-minded as Bruce, but I think he
the
has a lot of that
intent is
anger.
Yeah.
And
you can almost draw a line between, you can almost draw a line between Bruce to Carlin to Hicks to
I think
Marin.
Letterman's in there too.
Letterman and Marin. They'd be in
Yeah.
that thread of angry comedy, which I think
Yeah.
Lewis Black would
100%
come off of as well.
and when I mentioned Lewis Black and Greg Proops, they grew up watching the people that Lenny Bruce would talk to and encourage.
Right.
So it's just like they still have a great reverence for that time. Lewis Black started at the Hungry Eye as well.
Yeah.
I think Lewis Black, Kinnison, and Hicks are in a slightly different class. They're very angry, and that becomes part of the bit, the character of them being so angry.
Well, it's interestingly though, because I went to see Kevin McDonald do a live thing, and
Kevin's
Of the
so
Kids in the
sweet.
Hall?
Yeah.
Kids in the Hall,
Yeah,
and
he's great.
Lewis Black opened for them
Right.
when they were at the Hungry Eye,
Yeah.
and he wasn't as angry. That's a later development. Like there's
Interesting.
still the same basic premise, but it's like the voice has changed over the years slightly in that, but it's like still the same core, and that's interesting to me. It's like you find that sweet spot.
Did
Well, yeah.
Marin was in town filming a movie, and he was doing like drop-in sets and stuff all around. And he's back for JFL. But the drop-in set I saw him do was 30 minutes on him dealing with his own toxic masculinity and acknowledging it. So I'm like, that's a Lenny Bruce thing.
It
but
is.
it's just it's less political and more just
More
like
personal.
into the human condition.
Which I think is the
itself.
change. I think that's the change culturally in comedy too. We've moved away from political thought to self-reflection.
Well, we've talked about this a lot, that we expect our comedians to be vulnerable with us now.
Yeah.
We want to know who they are and what they've suffered with, and we want to relate to them, but also hope that they've suffered maybe a bit more than we have.
Yeah.
Like, it used to be we went to comedy to be told something by an expert, and now we go to see some schlub tell us how crappy their life is.
Right. When the doctor
Makes
told me
people
I
feel
was
better.
bipolar, it's like, yeah, license to print money.
On that
If you let
note-
me out of this padded room, I am going to make so much cash.
Well, we never will.
Yeah. But like Chris Gethard, Maria Bamford, Ed Jonathan Winters, again, was very open about like he was in an insane asylum for a bit, which seems like, have we changed the word for that? That seems...
I don't think it really exists in that
they
form anymore.
closed them all in the 80s, and Reagan closed them all in the States.
They called them sanatoriums.
They just let them
sanitariums.
loose.
They literally did. That's where a lot of the homeless come from. It's insane.
Yeah.
And what do we have? We have the Canadian Association for Mental Health, CAMH, here in Toronto.
Yeah.
I mean,
they're just
that's-
hospitals, but
Yeah,
they're
basically, but with a specialty.
Yeah.
Yeah. On that note,
No, but it is true. You want them to be more personal and open up, which is another
we
thing
want
that
to hear
I
they're
think
crazy.
Lenny introduced, because even on that album, to a certain extent, I feel like it's not for us. It's for 100% everyone that's in that room.
Yeah.
He is feeding
Right.
off of their energy
Right.
and guiding the experience that they're having together. Because he stops too much to acknowledge someone who was yelling, who was fooling around with the mic, because he knows it's bad.
It's
which
an
is
intimate performance, for
and
sure.
it's a sign of a good comic to like be able to do your material and still be present. But at the same time, I know, like, I've seen comics live versus like we were recording an album. Okay, this is by the book. This is clean, and there's still good albums, but you can hear the difference.
Yeah.
It's always fun when there's a little bit of riffing at some point. It feels fresher and more off the top, and that's fun. All right, guys. Well, that's Lenny Bruce. Thank you very much for listening. My guest has been Andrew Lizotte, and you can find him
Twitter, Instagram, all of the things is at Thin Lizotte.
Lizotte.
Indeed, yes. It's
and
French.
My producer has been Matthew Ardill. And you're a student of comedy full on these days. You're You're doing Second City. And
Second City. I am in a sketch troupe now. We just had our first show on Wednesday.
What's it called?
Weird Town.
Weird Town. Look that up. You have a Facebook page, and you
have a
do
Facebook
digital
page.
content as well.
Yeah. We do sketches that are on YouTube.
Awesome. My name's Jason DeLon. You can find me right here. Thank you for listening. We'll see you next time on Comedy Album Book Club.
Looks like you need a vacation. Enter the 5-Hour Energy Where Will the Tide Take You sweepstakes. You could win a $10,000 dream beach vacation. Imagine jet setting off to a tropical paradise, having fun in the sun, or diving at a gorgeous reef. It's up to you. No purchase necessary. Go to 5HETide.com for official rules and to enter. That's 5HETide.com. Enter today. Ends June 30th, 2024.
When you visit Arizona, time is measured in moments, not minutes. Like the moment your work stress disappears as you kayak through the canyons. Or the moment you discover the life-changing effects of prickly pear chocolate. But nothing beats the moment you see the Grand Canyon for the very first time. Visit a new state of mind. Learn more at hereyouareaz.com.